Hey quilters, today I'm going to go over a few different ways that you can square half square triangles. So I've got some here. So let's just get right into it. So I'm going to square these to 6.5 inches. And what you'll do, I'm using a 12.5 inch ruler right now, 12.5 inch square ruler, but it doesn't really matter what ruler you use, just so long as it's big enough to cover your whole half square triangle. So we're squaring these to 6.5 inches. One way that you can square this is to take the 6.5 inch line here and the 6.5 inch line here and line it up with the edges of your half square triangle, and you'll take that diagonal line on your ruler and line it up with the seam in your half square triangle. And one thing to know about these particular half square triangles is that most of the time you won't have nearly as much wiggle room as I have here. I actually designed these measurements for a specific pattern, and I designed it to have plenty of wiggle room so that if you get a little wonky or any other mistakes, or if maybe if your half-inch seam allowance is a little big, then you have plenty of wiggle room to correct that. So depending on what pattern you use, what technique you use, you're probably not going to have this amount of wiggle room as you do here in these. I designed these specifically for wiggle room. Okay, so we've got 6.5 inch line here lined up with this side, 6.5 inch line here lined up with the other side, and I've got my diagonal line on my ruler lined up with the diagonal seam in the half square triangle. So we're going to get our rotary cutter and we're going to trim the edges. All right. So now that that is trimmed, we can just trim this other dog ear. And we have a nice square trimmed half square triangle. So another way you can do this, and this is kind of what you would do if maybe you didn't have a nice square edge to line up with. So if you didn't have a side that was nice and squared off to line up with whatever numbers you need. So the numbers you're going to line up with here would be whatever size you want to trim those to. So if you didn't have a nice square side to line these up with, you could do it a little bit differently. And what you would do is you would use that diagonal line on your ruler to line up with the diagonal line in your half square triangle, just like we did before. But instead of having the 6.5 inch line and the 6.5 inch line lined up with the sides, we're going to bring that in a little bit. So you've got the diagonal line lined up, but the 6.5 inch lines are actually within the sides, and this edge of the ruler is within those sides. So I said this is what you do if maybe you got a little bit wonky and you did not have one side that was nice and squared off to line up with. So trim, and then you'll flip this around and do the same thing on the other side. Now that we got this squared off, you actually can use the 6.5 inch line and the 6.5 inch line to line up with these two sides that we just squared off. And if you line those up, if you should, once they're lined up, be pretty well aligned as far as this diagonal line being lined up with the diagonal line in your seam. And I guess this one takes a little bit longer because you're trimming two sides instead of one. But when you do that, your dog ears will be trimmed and you won't have to worry about trimming off those dog ears later. And let me just show you one more thing with these half square triangles. Let's get one more here. So let's say I want to line up my 6.5 inch line and my 6.5 inch line here. Well, I can't actually do that because I'm not lined up diagonal line to diagonal line. And then that just makes it so that there's no way for me to know if, like where to trim as far as making sure that my points, like the diagonal part of this seam, is lined up evenly with the corners. So if I trim this right here, which I'm not going to do because I'm going to use this half square triangle, I don't want to mess it up. But if I trim this right here, then and make it a 6.5. My points, my diagonal line is not going to line up with the corners. So you want to make sure when you trim your half square triangles that you line this diagonal line on your ruler up with that seam in your half square triangles.